Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Communication and Religions conference on the intersection of faith, politics, and rhetoric in the U.S. presidential election. My name is Dr. McKenna Schray, and I am honored to serve as your host today. Sponsored by the Lilly Fellows Program, Seton Hall University is proud to present Communication and Religion in the 2020 U.S. presidential election, bringing together some of the foremost scholars in their fields to discuss and share their expertise with students, faculty, and the general public. Broadcast live to registrants across the country, this event will also be simulcasted by Shemaru, a leading media and distribution company based in India. The views expressed at this conference are those of the participants. The university, qua university, neither endorses nor opposes any candidate or political party. But in the grand tradition of academic inquiry and freedom brings you this conference, its scholars, and their views on what many have referred to as a critical juncture in both U.S. and world history. I am now excited to introduce today's speakers. First, Peter Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He is also a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, a CNN political commentator, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. His first book, The Good Fight, was published by HarperCollins in 2006. His second book, The Icarus Syndrome, was published by HarperCollins in 2010. His third book, The Crisis of Zionism, was published by Times Books in 2012. Beinart has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic, Newsweek, Slate, Reader's Digest, Die Zeit, Frankfurt Almeida Seite, and Policy, the Journal of the Northeastern Political Science Studies Association. He has appeared on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Charlie Rose, Meet the Press, The Colbert Report, and many other television programs. Beinart graduated from Yale University, winning a Rhodes Scholarship for graduate study at Oxford University. Thank you for joining us, Professor Beinart. Jon Radwan is an associate professor of communication and director of the Institute for Communication and Religion here at Seton Hall University. Dr. Radwan earned a BA in communication from the University of New Hampshire, an MA in communication studies from Northern Illinois University, and a PhD in speech communication from Penn State University. His teaching and research focus on the intersection of rhetoric and religion, examining how ancient traditions influence contemporary public discourse. He authored the popular Communication and Religion entry in the International Encyclopedia of Communication, and his work has been published in a range of professional periodicals, including the Journal of Communication and Religion and Journal of Media and Religion. In 2012, the Religious Communication Association awarded him Article of the Year for his rhetoric and public affairs essay entitled Contact Rhetoric, Bodies and Love in God is Love. For our discussion with Professors Beinart and Radwan, I will ask some of the questions posed by conference registrants, and we will conclude with about 15 minutes of Q&A with the audience. Please ask your questions via the chat feed, and at the end of today's event, please make sure to fill out the feedback form that will also be shared in the Q&A chat feed. I now give you Professors Beinart and Radwan with our first question. Our first question is from a student by the name of Becca. Her question is, why is this election in particular catering towards Christian Catholic ideologies and moral frameworks? From a Catholic perspective, is it appropriate for priests to comment on political matters specifically geared towards one party over another? Professor Beinart?
Wow, well, thank you so much for having me. I feel like Jon may be better equipped to answer part of that question than I am. I guess I would just say on the broader part of it, I think that Catholics, particularly white Catholics, have, over the last 50 years or so in American politics, been a kind of a quintessential swing group. I mean, obviously, it's a very, very large and diverse group of people, but I think there's a there's a narrative that has taken hold in American politics about the group of people that used to be called kind of white ethnics, which is essentially just to say people whose families immigrated to the United States in the late 19th or early 20th century, maybe in the mid 19th century, went through the travails of being immigrants and immigrant Catholics in a country where there was a very high degree of Protestant nativism, moved in large numbers into the Democratic Party with Franklin Roosevelt as the Democratic Party became more open became the party that was more open to immigrants, Catholic as well as Jewish, kind of in that allegiance by the New Deal and the kind of the prosperity of the post-war period, then became disillusioned with the Democratic Party in the wake of the kind of cultural movements of the 1960s and the Vietnam War, supported figures like Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, and that the Democratic Party has been kind of trying to get back ever since. And that if you look at the career of someone like Joe Biden, coming a Catholic who kind of comes into politics in the wake of that, of both the cultural changes of the 60s and the backlash against those cultural changes, you see him really spending his career kind of wrestling with this question. And even to this day, trying to essentially bring people, quote unquote, like him, who demographically are like him, whose parents may have been firmly Franklin Roosevelt Democrats, but who may have themselves drifted away from the Democratic Party because of cultural issues, because of national security issues. And so I think in that way, the notion of American Catholics, and I think particularly Anglo white Catholics, looms very large in this as a swing block in American politics. Again, I'm sure that John and others, at Seton Hall could speak to this in much greater depth and detail with more sophistication than me. But maybe that's just some opening words, and then I'll hand it off.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. It's a two-part question, so it's a little bit tricky. For the first part about this election in particular, catering toward Christian or Catholic ideologies and moral frameworks, I guess I'm not 100% sure there's a giant difference between this election and previous elections, especially when you just go broader Christian. There were clear appeals in the 2016 election and a clear connection between especially evangelical Christians and President Trump. And that pattern largely continues today. And for the second part, from the Catholic perspective, for leaders and especially priests to be commenting on political matters, especially party matters or candidates, that's a very interesting question, and it does have a clear answer. So yesterday we learned from Dr. Formicola about the myth of the Catholic vote, and one of her key theses was, as Professor Beinart just said, Catholics are maybe more diverse than most people think, and so he was clear to talk about white Catholics as opposed to maybe the whole block all together. And so there's a lot of diversity amongst Catholics. But for the leadership question, the church, like other religious organizations, is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And so the tax code prevents those types of organizations from endorsing candidates and from doing work for parties. With that said, the leaders are people, and people are citizens, or many people are citizens. And so in 1984, there was a landmark case where a Catholic leader finished preaching and went outside and made a statement about a candidate. And what was decided out of that case was that leaders are people too, and they have rights of free speech and political speech. So the organization itself can't work toward particular parties or candidates, but individuals are citizens. And really, I think that's a similar, the challenge of a priest or any Catholic leader. I face a similar challenge. I work for a Catholic institution, and it's not exactly the same, but it's similar in that the professoriate, the academic community, has clear guidelines on how professors are supposed to communicate on controversial issues, including politics. It's that first off, and Dr. Schray did this right at the beginning in her introduction, we're supposed to make clear that we're not speaking on behalf of the institution. And so I'll say that again right now. I'm not speaking on the behalf of Seton Hall University, but I am a scholar and I am a citizen, and I do pay attention to politics. And so when I'm in a scenario like this, where I'm speaking publicly, I have to think carefully through things and balance my responsibilities to the church and also to my own conscience. And so the decisions kind of falls on me. It's my values and my judgment and my personality. And so really, I try to do my best, and especially in the classroom, I try to be clear with my students. I do my best job of explaining all viable or valid perspectives on an issue. And then once I'm done with that, acknowledge that I am a human being with my own views and values, and here's how I'm interpreting frequently difficult issues. So that's a little bit of a long response. I hope it makes it clear that yes, priests can, outside of the pulpit, act as political speakers. And frequently they choose not to use that power, but every once in a while people do.
Great. Thank you so much, professors. Our next question is from a student named Andrew, and his question is, how is it that many Christians easily embrace the country's rising threat of white supremacy when the Bible teaches us that all people are created in God's image? Professor Beinart?
Wow, maybe I should let Jon jump in on that first. I mean, it's a topic that I'm very interested in, but I want to be careful as someone who's not Christian myself to show some humility in terms of making claims about how Christians are behaving or how they should be behaving. So why don't we let Jon start, and maybe I'll have some thoughts after he speaks.
Sure, I'm happy to do so. It is a tough issue, so I'm not happy about that issue. I'm actually very sad about a rise of white supremacy. The student is right. The Bible does clearly teach that everybody is created in God's image. And so any kind of supremacy angle is completely inappropriate. The Bible has a lot of teaching, though. It's a big book. And especially out of Genesis, we get the fall narrative. So this is not a perfect world, and people for sure are not perfect. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. And white supremacists are not perfect. So Christians, in many traditions more than others, but they confess, and I'll confess, I'm a sinner. I've got problems. I've got weaknesses, and I need help. I need divine grace. I need your help. I need the president's help. I need the community's help. I need everybody's help. And so nobody's perfect. If we move forward past Genesis toward the Gospels, hypocrisy is an especially grievous sin that Jesus frequently decries. And so white supremacy is a clear hypocrisy, in my opinion, especially when you read the Declaration of Independence or even the Pledge of Allegiance, where you try to say something that your country values equality, and then you act as a hypocrite and don't work for equality or respect it. And so, unfortunately, it's not a surprise that there are some Christians supporting white supremacy. It's not a surprise because lots of us have flaws. We all have flaws. They go in different directions, in different angles. And so sometimes our hypocrisy might be about race. Sometimes our hypocrisy might be about class, sometimes about gender, all types of inequalities. And how to deal with that is a major challenge. But I would say the main gospel teaching is to deal with it with love. So a supremacist, in my opinion, is looking for a fight. And so joining into the fight tends to escalate conflict. Instead, trying to show a better way and demonstrate love, and especially political love, is something that maybe we could all rise to. And for anybody who's not familiar, with Pope Francis's new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. It just came out earlier this month. I would encourage everybody to check it out. You go to Vatican.va and it's right in the top right corner, and you can click on the English translation. He's got a whole section on politics at the end. And his teaching on politics is, I find it very encouraging and inspiring. Politics is a noble calling. Politics is about the common good. And yes, there are many hypocrites in our world, but there are also many people striving for the common good. And as citizens and political actors, we should resist a temptation to, and Dr. Polito spoke about this yesterday, resist a temptation to develop cynicism toward our political process and get demotivated by hypocrites, and instead try to strive for the common good together. So I'm sorry if that was a long answer, but it's a very difficult question. White supremacy is fairly clearly on the rise, and fairly clearly there are Christians involved with it. We can answer it with love. Professor Beinart, did you want to try to follow that?
Let's go on to the next question. I think that was a great answer.
Thank you, Dr. Radwan. All right, our next question is also on a sensitive topic. This question is from a student by the name of Eric, and his question is do you think Christianity's opinion on abortion will have an impact on voters? I'll leave it to either of you, but Professor Beinart, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. Well, leaving aside the question of what Christianity's viewpoint is, right? Because different Christians might disagree on that. I can say something about how I think the abortion issue has played itself out in American politics. I mean, I think abortion has been an issue that has come to define both of the political parties. It didn't always, as in the 1980s, even into the 1990s, there were a significant number of prominent anti-abortion Democrats. Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, the majority leader in the Senate, was anti-abortion. There were prominent pro-choice Republicans. I mean, I think John and I are from the kind of same part of the world. I grew up in Boston. I remember elections. You would have found them all over in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, elections where you would have Catholic anti-abortion Democrats running against Protestant pro-choice Republicans, right? And that there was a certain cultural coherence to those political views. So the abortion has become an issue which was always deeply divisive, but has now become overwhelmingly partisan in more than it was, and I think that has made it even more politically toxic, since there's very little now diversity, at least at the elite level, in both parties on this question. I also think that abortion has become a kind of symbol of connected to many other things. The role of the judiciary in society, where you had conservatives deeply resentful that the judiciary was a kind of force for a lot of progressive changes that they felt like should have come through the legislative process in the 1960s and 70s. And now that the shoe is on the other foot, that you have much more conservative power in the judiciary, a kind of progressive fear that there's kind of going to be a kind of anti-democratic move by the judiciary on this question. I think one of the big unknowns about the way that the country is deeply divided on abortion. I think I would say if you had, from 10,000 feet, I think in many ways the issue has kind of been a wash for the two political parties. I do think that the big question that we may find out the answer to in the coming years is, do the politics of abortion shift if we get closer to a moment in which states are allowed to outright ban an abortion, right? Which is to say there has been a hypothesis, which is to say that the closer you get to outright banning abortion, the worse the politics of abortion become for the anti-abortion movement, which is to say the closer we get to a world in which many American women do not have the right to an abortion in their state, the more that will mobilize pro-choice people and maybe even make some ambivalent people shift to the pro-choice position. And I think that's, one of the big questions that we may face in the coming years if we do have a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court that would be in a position to actually overturn Roe v. Wade and therefore give states the right to outlaw abortion outright.
I have to substantially agree with Professor Beinart on that one, and so I just add a little bit. The way the question is phrased, and this isn't a criticism. This is just me trying to deal with the question. Many Christians would not see their position on abortion as an opinion. Instead, it's clear teaching and a clear part of all life issues. It's one issue within the broader life teaching. And in the Christian tradition, life is sacred from conception through natural death. So with that said, does that viewpoint have an impact on voters? Yes. And then especially, there are many single issue voters who are willing to, apparently, put up with other behaviors and policies that seem to contradict biblical teaching and focus in on just abortion and the right to life of the unborn. And so there are many single issue voters. And then the reference to the Supreme Court that Professor Beinart made is really just excellent. Yesterday, Dr. Formicola shared her opinion that, and some history too, that in general, Supreme Court decisions don't get overturned. She cited 5 cases across the whole history of the Supreme Court that got overturned. And so her view, which I do think is a valid one, is that perhaps when the Supreme Court is populated a certain way, that might get eroded a bit, but a complete overturning seems unlikely. And then for the single issue voters, the president doesn't make a decision, right? The president is president. They can't overturn Roe v. Wade all by themselves. It's a Supreme Court type of thing. And President Trump has campaigned on a promise to appoint conservative judges really throughout the whole hierarchy of our legal system. And he has largely delivered on that promise. So one thought might be that single issue voters could be happy, and maybe even since that single issue, it's not over yet, but maybe since that single issue has made some substantial progress, they might think about other issues as they cast their vote in this election. That's the best I can do on that one. That's a tough issue.
Great. Thank you so much, professors. This next question is one that I think hopefully you both can speak to, and it's by a student by the name of Matt. And Matt's question is, why do people of a certain religious tendencies tend to vote the way they do? For example, evangelical Christians mainly throw their support behind Trump, and non-Orthodox Jews mainly vote Democratic, while Hasidic Jews tend to lean Republican. Professor Beinart, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Sure. I think these questions, the different communities, I think often the kind of the culture of a community often tends to shape its political outlook. Let's take Judaism, for instance. The questioner asked about non-Orthodox Jews who do overwhelmingly vote Democratic, and then he talked about Hasidic Jews. I would broaden that a little bit to Orthodox Jews in general, right? Jews overall vote about 75% Democratic. Orthodox Jews vote about 75% Republican. So there's a very, very clear cleavage. It's not uncommon today to be in a liberal kind of a non-Orthodox Jewish community where people will say that part of what it means to be Jewish is to be progressive politically. And you can go to an Orthodox community where people might say that part of what it means to be Jewish is to be conservative politically. One way of trying to understand that is to understand what Orthodox and, let's say, Reform or kind of more liberal versions of Judaism, how they see religious authority and religious tradition, right? Orthodox Judaism is conservative. There's an understanding that basically that what Jews call the kind of the written and the oral law, the written law being the Hebrew Bible and the oral law being the Talmud that Orthodox Jews believe was also given to Moses on Mount Sinai, which is essentially a vast commentary and legal system which literally kind of can govern virtually every aspect of your life. That was given at Sinai, and that it has enormous weight, and that religion and that innovating is something that should be done with extreme care, if at all. And there's an enormous veneration towards generations past, and the notion is essentially the closer you were to Sinai, the deeper insight you have into God's will, and therefore we know less and less as we have moved further away from that momentous event when the Jewish people were closest to God. So that's going to have an impact. That's going to, in general, incline you to a view that is conservative in general, which is to say that things that have been around a long time, strong traditions that have existed for a long time, you are likely to give those a lot of weight, even if it's not a specific question of religious law, but it's a question of cultural and societal context. Judaism, whereas progressive Jews, let's say, Reform Jews, let's say, or Reconstruction Jews, will be likely to say have made themselves dramatic innovations in recent decades in order to try to make Judaism, and going back to the 19th century, in trying to make Judaism more modern, and essentially bring the spirit of progress, of human advancement, about the role of women, let's say, about many other issues where Reform Jews are likely to say human being have advanced. There's been progress. We are more enlightened in many ways than the figures in the 5th century who wrote the Talmud, or what we call the Rishonim, the medieval thinkers like Maimonides or Rashi, who gave the major commentaries on things. And so we have the right to revise their views. And that also, that perspective, that belief that change can bring progress, can bring advancement, also is likely to make you more inclined to want to change many aspects of society where you see injustice. The other thing, and I think that's my guess, is that basic dynamic between reverence for inherited tradition and the belief in change as a vehicle for progress is not unique to Judaism, that you would find some of those same divisions in Christianity. What I think may be somewhat more distinct about Judaism is that Judaism is both a universalistic religion and a deeply particularistic religion. It is a religion that believes that all people were created in the image of God, and that the first characters in the Hebrew Bible are not Jews. Adam, Eve, Noah, etc. These are not Jews. But starting with the story of Abraham, we read the Hebrew Bible as the story of a family that becomes a nation, a people, and it's our people, our nation, that the central metaphor in Judaism in some ways is the metaphor of Jews as an extended family. And so therefore, one of the deep tensions within Judaism is not only between tradition and change, it's between universalism and particularism. It's between how much we need to be concerned about our own welfare, right? And how much we need to be concerned about the welfare of others. In this famous expression of Hillel, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, what am I? Famously, the commentators say what, not who, because it's kind of, you become less than human if you only focus on yourself. So you can see this debate on a question like the debate about Israel, which is to say, should Jews take the view that whatever they perceive to be best for Israel is the way they should vote because we need to be focused on our own? Or should they say, actually, no, we have many broader obligations to non-Jews in our own society, and maybe even to the non-Jews, the Palestinians who live in Israel. And therefore, we should not only see this from a self-interested tribal perspective. The perspective inside the Orthodox community is much more particularistic and tribal. The perspective in the more secular elements of the American Jewish community is much more universalistic. So this also helps to explain the division.
That was a very complete and excellent answer. I don't have too much to add to it. I guess I would say that Why do people of a certain religion tend to vote the way they do? Well, one way to think about it is to think about what a religion is, and Professor Beinart did an excellent job. A start is a religion can be seen as a culture, but then it's a particular type of culture. It's a culture with a relationship to God, and then many of them are scriptural traditions on top of it. So it's not just a relationship, it's a relationship with clear written teaching that people can refer to continuously throughout history. Another way to think about a religion, aside from just a culture, is to think about it as a social movement. And so it's moving forward into the future. And I think that's at least one of the ways I think of the Catholic Church, especially since Vatican II, as the people of God, right? It's the people, they're God's people, but they're moving forward, and Vatican II was a step forward, a modernizing step, and really an opening step to the modern world to try to engage. And so the people at the center of the movement, the people not on the fringes, the people at the center of the movement, they're going to have a fair amount of consistency. It's almost literally what defines it as a movement. If you didn't have that number of people, that critical mass to even recognize it as a movement, it would be a random kind of collection of people. So really any religion, but especially scriptural traditions, because it's a clear text to tie to, move forward through history. And as they do, in Vatican II, it's the ressourcement theme, where you keep coming back to your sources as you move forward. And so that's an attempt to add a little bit to Professor Beinart's answer.
Great, thank you, professors. Our next question is from a student named Justin, and Justin's question is, since Trump took office in 2016, there has been 6 major attacks on Jewish institutions in the United States. There had been 5 major attacks total in the 10 years before his election. How important is it to combat this type of terrorism towards religious institutions to these candidates? Professor Beinart, any thoughts on that question?
Sure. So in terms of why we have seen kind of more violent anti-Semitism in the United States in recent years. The United States, I think it's important to say, has been, from a Jewish perspective, in its long history, remarkably free of violent anti-Semitism compared to the countries in Europe and to some degree in the Middle East, where Jews lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I think it was quite a shock to many Jews to see the attacks on synagogues in Pittsburgh and then in Southern California. And there's a very, very fierce debate among American Jews about whether, if at all, to hold Donald Trump responsible for that. I guess my perspective would be this, which is to say that I don't think anti-Semitism can be entirely segregated off from other forms of intolerance and bigotry. I think that there is an interplay between them, so that sometimes, even if you don't set out to foster anti-Semitism, hatred against Jews, the hatred that you foster against other groups can actually blow back and impact Jews. And it's worth looking at what actually happened in Pittsburgh as a kind of a case study in that. So if you remember, at that time, there was a tremendous amount of paranoia that had been whipped up, at least in my view, about these supposed caravans that were coming of people seeking asylum and immigration to the United States from Central America. And the shooter in Pittsburgh was very, very worried about this. But interestingly, he came to the view that it was Jews who were organizing these caravans, right? George Soros, and he ultimately attacked the synagogue because it had participated in a program with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was a historic Jewish organization that helps immigrants. Now, why would someone possibly look at all of these refugees coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and basically see the hidden hand of Jews there? I think it has to do with the particular stereotypes that people have historically had about Jews, which are not the same as the stereotypes they've tended to have about Black people and brown people often. Though the stereotypes about Jews have often been of the sinister genius, the kind of the hidden hand which somehow manages to organize the whole world behind the scenes because of some extreme amount of power and perhaps even certain kind of superpower qualities. And when you combine, whereas the stereotype of Black and brown people has often been the racist stereotype of intellectual inferiority. So that's why, for instance, in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, it was segregationists often said that it was the Jewish communists who were actually running the Civil Rights Movement because that was absurd, but because they were racist, they didn't believe that African Americans could actually be organizing a political movement of their own. And so I think you saw an echo of this with the gentleman in Pittsburgh. Because he was a racist, he didn't believe that this migration, who was actually being organized by people from Latin America themselves, and he believed that Jews were actually the kind of hidden hand who were behind it. So in his xenophobia and his hostility and his bigotry towards Latino people, he then lashed out against Jews because he believed that they were the ones who were actually bringing this horrific, quote unquote, invasion by these non-white people into the United States. And to me, it's a good example. The lesson for me of this is that our protection lies in supporting one another, that it is folly to believe that essentially Jews, because most Jews in America are now considered white, can stand aside from the white nationalism that oppresses Black people or Latino people or Muslim people because Donald Trump has, Jewish grandchildren, people to say that in fact the bigotry that is fanned against them ultimately comes back to us, and that's why we need to stand up for them, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's in our own self-interest.
Thank you for another strong answer, Professor Beinart. The hidden hands theme, I think, is one that a lot of people overlook. And so all terrorism or all racism tends to get lumped together. And so the Jewish fear, the fear of the superpower behind everything is, in my view, particularly insidious. It's as you said, absurd. It's how does anybody run things long distance? It's a deep-seated fear and an explanation of other things that are maybe inexplicable, as you said, to a racist. And then for the end of the question, which is a strong question, is how important is combating this type of terrorism? Well, it's hugely important to combat all terrorism. But then toward religious institutions, to these candidates, how important is it to each candidate? And for that, we'd have to, analyze the campaigns and study the rhetoric of each candidate. And I can't say I've done a complete study of anti-Semitism and anti-terrorist rhetoric for both candidates, but I did watch the debate fairly closely just last night. And Joe Biden accused President Trump of pouring gas on the fire of really all divisions and all discrimination and racism. And that's a fairly strong metaphor. It is a debate, so there's a lot of strong language and strong metaphors and strong statements. But that's, I think, one of the clearest instances I can point to where one candidate is accusing the other of exacerbating problems and causing divisions to grow and in the metaphor, burn.
Great. Thank you, professors. Our next question is from a student named Brandon. And Brandon's question is, do Christian voters take religion into consideration more strongly when voting for candidates than actual policies? And if so, which candidate has swayed more voters in this election? Any thoughts, Professor Beinart?
Wow. Well, I mean, I think it's hard to generalize, right? I mean, I don't know exactly what percentage of American public defines itself as Christian, but I think it's a you know, I think a clear majority of the countries. You're talking about you know, hundreds of millions of people. I do think that every religious tradition, at least as I understand it, has different elements and contains multitudes, and one can emphasize or de-emphasize different things, as Professor Radwan was talking about earlier on this question of abortion. And I think what's interesting to ask is why it is that certain people emphasize certain elements versus others, right? So, for instance, if you look at the division between white Christians and Black Christians, is a kind of a very, very broad generalization, right? Black Christians are much more likely to vote Democratic than are white Christians. Not that there aren't lots of white Christian Democrats, of course there are, right? But Black Christians are, you know, are voting Democratic at, you know, 80–90%, right? Whereas white Christians are voting Democratic at, let's say, 40%. And that's not necessarily and white, because Black Christians are necessarily more liberal on some of the cultural issues that might be influencing some white Christians, whether it's, let's say, the issue of abortion, for instance, but they tend to emphasize different things, and I think that you need to look at the kind of people's lived experience and their communal experience to understand why they see certain elements in their religious tradition as more relevant. So I think for Black Christians who have suffered hundreds of years of kind of racial oppression in the United States, that it may be those elements in the Christian tradition that speak more about social justice and about equality that may be more relevant given their experience as a historically disenfranchised and marginalized group in their voting concerns, rather than the kind of the the issues having to do with personal conduct, let's say, that may speak more to certain white Christians. And so I think what's I always find really fascinating is to try to understand what it is in people's lived experience and also in their other identities, right? Because all of us have multiple identities. There are religious identities, there's also their gender identities, their racial and ethnic and national identities, and to understand how those intersect to lead them to kind of shine a flashlight on certain elements of their own religious tradition, and to define that as the essence of what it means to be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, and yet often leave many other things out because those things are not as consonant with the way they want to see the world.
That's a really strong point on intersectionality. The multidimensional nature of human identity is, in my view, a given. And then the question is, do religious voters and especially Christian voters, do they let that dimension, do they let that section of their identity dominate over the rest of a complex personality? And that's a tough question. I mean, each individual voter, maybe you can figure out with an interview. I'd say in general, I'd go back to the theme of diversity amongst Christians. There are many different brands or versions or sects of Christianity, and even amongst Catholics, there's diversity. And so for that one, the exact direction, if they're going to focus on that one part of their identity, the exact direction that takes them into the voting booth with, the exact energy and vector it takes them in with, it varies. So we saw clearly in 2016, and I think we're seeing it again, that some devout Christians praise and vote for President Trump, while other devout Christians see him as nearly opposite of almost everything the Bible is teaching. And reconciling that diversity is, again, I would want to go to an individual level, like maybe at a family level, right? So if your family is devout, you could talk through with a son or daughter, a spouse, maybe even a cousin if you're good with them, to try to talk through, is this religious commitment dominating all the other parts of what makes you you? And if so, okay, good. Now, how is it bringing you into the voting booth? And especially if you disagree with your cousin or your uncle or your brother, to maybe talk it through and see if you can enlighten one another. And then I guess the key part of that conversation is it's not genuine if you yourself aren't open to change. So if your cousin is able to make a valid argument, are you a big enough person to open your mind and admit that they might influence you as you're headed into the voting booth? So yeah, multidimensional and intersectional identity is it's really just kind of the center of critical theory nowadays. And it for me comes down to very personal. We're all unique.
Great, thank you, professors. I have one more question from a student before we move on to some submitted questions from visitors and faculty. And this question is from a student named Amber. And Amber's question is, presidents of the United States have mostly been Christians. There has been only one Catholic president, being the late JFK. Will Joe Biden, being a Catholic, affect how people vote or look on certain issues such as abortion? Professor Beinart?
You know, I think it's quite striking in some ways how little Joe Biden's Catholicism, I think, has played a role publicly in the conversation about this election. You know, especially certainly if you think about how dominant an issue certainly it was when Al Smith ran as the first major party nominee in 1928. You know, and in the face of enormous anti-Catholic opposition and bigotry, and even John F. Kennedy, who had to give an entire speech basically to dispel concerns that he would take orders from the Pope. You know, I think it's a sign of progress that not very many people are asking Joe Biden that he needs to disavow the Vatican or promise that he will be loyal to the U.S. Constitution. But I do think it is very important for Americans to remember that history, because I think it helps us understand and get some distance on some of the current kind of phobias and paranoias and bigotries that exist. So, for instance, one of the things that we've heard a lot over the last 20 years, and including from some, I think, sadly, some very prominent people in the Trump administration and the Republican Party, is that if you are a Muslim who follows Sharia law, Islamic law, that you cannot be also loyal to the U.S. Constitution. This is the kind of thing you hear on Fox News and other places all the time. That basically you can't be that you can't be a loyal American and a kind of a devout Muslim who follows Muslim law. And it's worth remembering that there was a time when prominent Americans were saying that you could not be a devout Catholic who followed the teachings of the Vatican and also be loyal to the U.S. Constitution, because when we can see in retrospect how absurd that claim was, it should help us understand now how absurd that claim is when it's leveled at American Muslims. And so I think that one of the challenges, I think, of us in understanding American history is to celebrate progress, but also always see that there are cyclical patterns and use the progress we've made in our ability to see Catholics in a way that perhaps many Protestants were not able to see them 100 years ago, as a way of informing the way we see other religious groups that may not have achieved the same level of public acceptance that, for instance, Catholics have now.
That's a fantastic theme on history. Too often we see discrimination and isolation, and really I think it's maybe just an American education issue that our education system needs to do a better job helping us remember both tragedies of the past and then also triumphs of the past and taking it forward. And I guess the only thing I want to add, in addition to everybody should study history, is that Joe Biden is a practicing Catholic. However, Catholics are diverse, and he's a leader who has established a clear pro-choice position. And so that diversity is really across all groups. And I guess the only thing I'd like to add too is diversity in the Muslim community. So in addition to the fear appeals that Professor Beinart cited, there's the trope that Muslims are somehow trying to impose Sharia law on the whole country, and it's just not that kind of organization. Especially in contrast to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is a big hierarchy, and so maybe international hierarchy. So maybe if they had that value, they could try. But for a relatively flat organization like Muslim organizations, it's in my view just a sad, misguided trope.
Thank you, professors. I'd like to move on to a few questions from some visitors as well as some faculty members. This question is from a visitor by the name of Samir, and Samir has this question. Two important religious groups have been involved in American politics. How do you compare the role of evangelicals and American Jews in the coming election and long term in the future? Professor Beinart?
Well, when one talks about white evangelical Christians, their political behavior these days is very, very different than American Jews. Again, I mean, white evangelical Christians are really the mainstay of the Republican Party and have of course, not all white evangelical Christians, of course, there's diversity, but in general tend to be a kind of on the, a kind of mainstay of the Republican Party and of conservative politics in the United States, including in the Trump era. Whereas American Jews have, again, been kind of remarkably consistently going back to the New Deal in voting Democratic and essentially lining up on the progressive side of kind of most domestic political issues. Now, why is that? I think there are a couple answers. First of all, American Jews have, again, not all, but to make a majority of them, to make generalizations, a strong sense of ourselves as having been a historic minority, and a fear, therefore, of national identities that appear exclusive, because in so many historical situations, exclusive national identities were used to define Jews as the other. And so I think exclusive or narrow definitions of American nationalism, even if they're seen to exclude other people like, immigrants or Muslims or LGBT people or whatever, often make Jews worried, because the notion of Jews are a small minority, and the notion of defining America as a Christian nation is threatening to American Jews. So I think that's one answer. It's the sense of the recognition of Jews as a minority that has been historically persecuted. I think in this way, actually, there's an interesting connection between Jews and LDS people, Mormons, who also have a strong sense of themselves as having been a historically persecuted minority, which I think helps explain why LDS Christians have been actually less willing to embrace Donald Trump than evangelical Christians have in general. The other difference is that American Jews are simply, in general, again, these are big generalizations, quite a bit more secular than are evangelical Christians. If you simply look at the rate of attendance of religious services, or the percentage of people who say they believe in God, or a whole series of questions like this, American Jews are a very secular population overall. And if among white Americans in general, there is a cleavage in which people who tend to be more secular tend to be more politically to the left, and people who tend to be more religiously observant, again, this is among white Americans, tend to be more politically conservative. And so essentially that divide exists among American Jews, but the whole center of gravity among American Jews is shifted in a more secular direction. And given that secularism tends to track with views on issues like abortion, let's say, and again, in general, with a kind of greater tolerance, that one of the dirty little secrets of American Jewish political voting behavior is that American Jewish political voting behavior, except for in the non-Orthodox community, among non-Orthodox American Jews, political voting behavior is pretty similar to the political voting behavior of agnostics and atheists, or people who say they have no religious affiliation, which is to say, people focus a lot on the fact that these are Jews, but instead of focusing on what religion they are, it would make more sense to focus on the degree of religious observance they have. And there that you see that what's defining about American Jews is not the fact that they're Jewish, it's the fact that they're not that religiously observant. And they act like other Americans who are not that religiously observant, most of whom tend to be on the left politically.
I'll just add a little bit to that. That was an excellent response. The evangelical support of President Trump in 2016 is a proven fact. And then as we head into this election, in general, there has been reporting on some erosion of that evangelical support. And so overall, especially in comparison with Catholics, evangelicals seem more united and more organized, but not in the same way as 2016. And then I also appreciated Professor Beinart's reference to the LDS community, and would just say that recent LDS teaching on anti-racism is something that's really needed for the entire country, and then especially in the Christian community. And I'm hopeful that themes like that begin to come more to the fore.
Thank you, professors. I'd like to share one or two more questions before we move on to our Q&A with audience members. I'm going to go ahead and share a question from a faculty member named Robert. His question is, should study of the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament play a more central role in how Christians approach discussion of and communication around the election? Professor Beinart?
So, I mean, I think that there's tremendous moral power in a lot of the prophetic books of again, what Christians call the Old Testament, what we tend to call the Hebrew Bible. You have figures, prophets like Nathan, Jeremiah, Elijah, essentially challenging kings, challenging people in power and calling them to account for their abuse of power, which I think is a perennially inspiring lesson, and I would say a particularly important one today, when since I'm of the view that we have a president who is abusing his power in very, very dangerous and disturbing ways. So I think that prophetic tradition that people like that Abraham Joshua Heschel famously wrote about is something that has eternal relevance. I mean, I do think it is worth noting that again, as we said, every religious tradition contains multitudes. There's also much in the prophetic books, you know, in books like Joshua and Judges, Samuel and Kings, that is very violent, that is very nationalistic, and you could even say verges on genocidal in its essentially instructions to the Israelite people in terms of how they were supposed to take possession of the land and how they were supposed to respond to the peoples of the land. And it's worth remembering that, you know, the political philosopher Michael Walzer wrote a famous book called Exodus and Revolution, really about the prophetic, about the Exodus story, but also about this, the story of Jews, of kind of Jews taking kingship and creating a monarchy in the prophetic books in what we call the land of Israel. And Edward Said famously wrote a response called Exodus and Revolution, a Canaanite view, in which he essentially emphasized that we also need to remember, as we think about these stories, about the non-Israelite peoples who were also in that land, because the same books that have these enormously powerful moral messages about standing up for the weak and the downtrodden and standing up to people who abuse their authority also have very, very different messages, ones that I think can lead to kind of terrible abuse. So I think it's worth trying to hold both of those at the same time.
That's a good balanced perspective. I guess I'd add, for Christians, the other balancing factor is the Greek Bible, right? The Gospels. So the question about a study of the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament, I would say yes, please, but not in isolation. But even if you are doing it in isolation, American history, and especially with Dr. King, there are like clear resonances in direct quotations and direct inspiration from the prophets through American leaders. And so, Amos was one of Dr. King's favorite prophets, and he preaches against abuse of the poor and against crimes like bribery or hoarding wealth. And then let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. It's just eternal, inspirational truth, and that those words have power. And neglecting them would be to the detriment of all. So the short answer to the question is yes, everybody should study the Hebrew Bible, and also hopefully study the whole thing, not just select parts, and also see it in maybe a larger context all the way up to the 20th century with Dr. King, and of course now 21st century.
Great, thank you, professors. I'd like one more final question, and I think it's a really a great question to really end with. And this is from a visitor named Madalena. Her question is, I'm observing so many Christian groups lining up for Trump or Biden. Doesn't this citing for one side in such an evident way risk creating more fractures? Doesn't taking sides risk canceling the University of Faith, which is a bridge for dialogue and not a moat of division? Professor Beinart, any thoughts on our final question?
Look, it's different. Politics is inherently about division to some degree, right? And in fact, life is about division in the sense that, to create a strong community, it means that if any community, particularly the strong communities, will have people who are not in those communities as well as inside those communities, right? So I don't think there is something wrong with having a strong political view, a strong moral view that you express in political terms, forming associations around those views, and appealing and participating in the political process on behalf of those views, even though it will mean that there are other people on the other side. I think that's inevitable, and I think it's legitimate, and I think it's necessary. I think the challenge is to have moral passion and also have humility at the same time. I think that's the balance. To feel deeply, to fight strongly for what it is that you believe, and yet try to attack the arguments of the other side rather than attacking people in ad hominem ways. Try to listen to them with the recognition that you are fallible too. Be willing to reconsider your views if facts change, to try to make a practice of exposing yourself to opinions that don't always ratify your own, but that actually challenge you, to try to have other communities and other associations in your life which are not coterminous with your political views, which is to say, so that you may be getting together with the people who you want to get together with to elect Joe Biden or to pass the Green New Deal or whatever, but that you also have other experiences in your life, whether it's in your church or your kids' softball team or your PTA or your synagogue, whatever, which brings you into a different kind of community where you share different things, which is not defined by politics. I don't think it's wrong to have strong politically defined communities, but it's wrong if those are your only communities. And one of the things, just speaking personally, that I appreciate, even though it's sometimes difficult and challenging, is that the Jewish day school that my children attend and the synagogue that our family attends is not composed entirely, perhaps not even mostly, of people whose political views are the same as my own on Israel. Certainly, very much not. And I feel like it creates a continual practice for me in which I am forced to and reminded of the fact that people who may see the world in very different ways from me can still be extraordinary people that I should have respect for.
I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction. First, the question has a really interesting moat metaphor for division. The several Christian traditions, in my view, they don't seem to be explicitly about unity, or they don't place it above other values. And so I'm going to refer again to Pope Francis's new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. He preaches global brotherhood and sisterhood. He preaches global family. And one of the special teachings that I appreciated was that all other virtues are ordered to love, and that love is an especially unifying value. So courage is a great virtue and all, but courage is, kind of like entering into a battle, perhaps, maybe a political battle. And the teaching is that that's not a primary virtue. The primary virtue is a unifying value of love. And it is unifying in diversity, so it's not uniformity where everybody becomes exactly the same. One of the opening stories Pope Francis uses is from Saint Francis when he went to visit the Muslim Sultan during the Fifth Crusade. And Saint Francis's teaching to his brothers as they go on that trip is, when you find yourself amongst unbelievers, you don't argue. You don't try to convince them that your dogma is better than their dogma. Instead, you show humble submission. And that's a way to try to start building a relationship across, in that time, and really echoes in our time, warlike divisions between brothers, Abrahamic brothers. And so that's, I guess, I'm sorry if I'm citing Pope Francis a lot today, but that's, I think, some contemporary teaching on division, that Pope Francis thinks that we should all work for brotherhood and sisterhood.
Thank you, professors, for your insightful responses, and to our audience members and conference participants for the really thought-provoking questions. We do have time for perhaps one or two questions from the audience here. I'm going to go ahead and share one of those questions in the chat now that we received, and it's definitely a question about a current event. And this question is from Mark, and Mark asks, do you think Amy Barrett will make a fair jurist? Will she judge with her conscience, not with her politics? And Professor Beinart, any thoughts you'd like to share on that question?
I don't think we have a common definition of what it means to be a fair justice, right? That's a deeply contested question. I think that from everything I can see about Amy Coney Barrett, she has a strong conviction in a certain way of reading the Constitution, a certain tradition of reading the Constitution, which I think will likely lead her, and there are many who embrace that, and it will likely lead, I think, probably lead to outcomes that some people really embrace and others find very threatening. I guess I would say my concern, again, I speak as someone who's politically progressive. It has nothing to do with her goodwill or her her kind of the degree to which she's sincere. It really has more to do with the way in which she has been put on the Supreme Court. I think that we are, for a whole variety of reasons, I think the Republican Party has resorted in recent years to more and more anti-democratic measures in order to maintain and expand its political power. Frankly, in a country where demographically is moving away from it, The Republican Party is, after all, the party that is rooted in the support of white people, and the Democratic Party is the party that is the party that's supported by the rising number of kind of non-white and non-Christian Americans. I think the Republican Party has responded to that, unfortunately, in recent years, and particularly with Trump, not by really competing for votes of historically disenfranchised people, but actually essentially to continue by trying to keep them disenfranchised, by making it harder to vote, by making it harder for people, immigrants, to be on the census, a whole series of things. And I think the progression of forces where Republicans, I don't think it's entirely coincidental that it was the first Black president that Republicans denied the right to appoint a Supreme Court justice to, when he appointed Merrick Garland in February, after the death of Antonin Scalia, and then have now embraced Donald Trump's ability to name Amy Coney Barrett, even though it's of course much closer to the election than it was when Garland was nominated. And I think this is not a criticism of Amy Coney Barrett per se, it's a criticism of the process that has led her now to be on the cusp of the Supreme Court. And I think what we are seeing is the consequences of that are a serious legitimization of the Supreme Court among many Democrats, and quite possibly a move by Democrats, if Joe Biden wins, to restructure the nature of the Supreme Court, which will be an extremely politically bruising fight, which may end up delegitimizing the Supreme Court in the eyes of many conservative Republicans. And I think this is, again, I don't want to suggest that Democrats and progressives are saints, that they bear no responsibility for this increasingly toxic partisanship, but I think the progression of action, starting with the Merrick Garland pick and now leading to Amy Coney Barrett, will resonate and have repercussions for many, many years that will have a very negative impact on the Supreme Court and a very toxic impact on American politics.
I can only say that, in my opinion, was very well said, Professor Beinart. There are consequences to anti-democratic moves within a democratic system, and it only, unfortunately, seems to be escalating. So for Judge Barrett, I can't look into her mind and heart. I can't presume to predict how she's going to behave and judge, but there's a much, much bigger picture, and that bigger picture is trending away from democratic practices.
Thank you, professors. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and limit our Q&A session to that particular question. But I do want to thank our scholars and our audience members for joining us today for the Institute in Communication Religion's final event as part of its Communication in Religion in the 2020 election virtual conference. If we did not get to your question today or earlier this week, I am excited to share that Dr. Ronald Arnett, the Yonder Wolf Endowed Chair of Communication Ethics at Duquesne University and a keynote speaker from a previous conference event, has agreed to answer remaining questions in an interview format. Please keep an eye out for that interview with Asia Robinson. Thank you again for your time and attention, and I encourage you to complete the feedback form at the top of the chat and stay connected with the Institute for Communication and Religion all year round at www.shu.edu/ICR. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.